Okay, so we have one more keynote before the tea break. Really pleased to welcome Charles Musselwhite from CTRAM. Charles is Professor and Head of Psychology at Aberystwyth University and co-director of CTRAM, the university's research centre for transport and mobility. He's also the incoming chair from June of next year for the UK-wide Universities Transport Study Group, a board member of the Transport and Health Science Group, and editor-in-chief for Elsevier's Journal of Transport and Health. Charles is going to share some learnings from THINK, the Transport and Health Integrated Research Network. This is one of two Welsh Government-funded projects for which Charles is principal investigator, and which highlights the importance of putting communities and people at the heart of transport decision-making.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for having me here today. And thanks so much for Pete for the shout out earlier on. Although I feel a bit starstruck being in a room with you. You've written the book that I've always wanted to write, so I really recommend everyone buying that book. It's great. I read it twice in about 3 weeks, I think. So some great, really innovative ideas and really puts people at the heart of transport. And that's exactly where I want to start this presentation today. And I'll probably end it a little bit with moving from people to community, which then segues nicely into Gemma's stuff next. See, we've all done this before. We've programmed it all together. So just as Pete was saying, then transport system as it is at the moment, it's often talked about as being I think it's joked about being the bastard son of economics and engineering. And that's really what's dominated the transport, or the way decisions are made in transport, and it still underpins a lot of our decisions in transport now. So it becomes a system that's really what we will call neoliberal. It's about independence, it's about freedom, it's about giving people choice to do what they want to do, and opening up choice for people to do stuff. It's very positivist, as we call it in academic business, so it's highlighted around seeking proof and seeking the truth that's out there. And it's very technocratic at the end of the day, so it's based around data, it's based around numbers. Now, none of those things are bad on their own. It's just that when they totally dominate things that has people at the center of it all, you end up with very skewed results, as Pete was saying earlier on. You end up with things like only dominant voices getting heard in the transport system. So only some people get to choose how that transport system looks. Like I said, it's about seeking the truth rather than looking for different perspectives within the transport system. One thing that's really nice being an academic and looking at the transport system is that I don't have to solve the problems. I only get to have to offer some solutions to other people, which is really nice. Although I am an academic that doesn't want my research sat on dusty shelves, so I do want to try and make a difference where we can. And yeah, so one thing that's really nice is where can we put the people back into the system? A system that's been really relied upon in terms of truth and accountability. All that's really important. You can't use public money without being, held accountable to some form or other. But there's been an over-reliance on the economy, if you like, and an over-reliance on tools, models, and quantitative data. That's really important. Like I said, you've got to be able to show the decision-making process, but it doesn't really put people at the heart of it all, and it misses out some of those nuances of where people are in the system, and really it ends with engineers talking about people being thought of as a nuisance. You sometimes hear that about doctors talking about people who don't adhere to their medicine as being a nuisance without trying to understand the wider context. And it's the same in transport. Why don't people behave in the way we want them to behave? We over-rely that technology will solve all our ills. Of course, it's part of the story, and that excellent presentation earlier about better data collection, showing it to decision makers in a better way. But we still need to make the decision at the end of the day based on that data. Data on its own is not going to solve it. And I think sometimes we think it will, and we think technology as the same. And therefore, we don't notice or measure the side effects very well. I think Pete said brilliantly earlier on that we don't measure the things that aren't in the system, and we've got to measure that better. So the people who don't use the buses but need to or want to, they're the ones that we need to understand more about as an example of that. I really like the quote from Phil Goodwin, some of you know, excellent academic, well-renowned for years and talked on this subject. better than I can. But he talked about that quantitative data and the models we've got of transport as an analytical toolkit that is bright, impressive, of unchallengeable intellectual achievement, and ultimately wrong, which I thought was great, because that is exactly at the end of the day. You know, it moves things on, it moves the conversation on, but we're not solving the things that we need to solve in transport. And that's why we end up with a system that's unsustainable and unhealthy at the end of the day. And that's because people aren't in the system. We need to put people back into the system, so we need to have that human-centric approach. When we do put people into the system, it's often a very aggregated, overarching overview. We don't look at the disaggregated elements to that. We still think that everybody works 9 to 5 in an office because that's the people who are making the decisions do that. But there's loads of different transport needs outside of that. Absolutely almost all the transport needs are outside of that, particularly after COVID. And like I said, we don't include people who don't or can't travel. I don't think the current system does very well for older people and their needs. We don't do very well for the 22% of households without access to a car in the UK. So people become marginalised as a result, and sometimes already marginalised people become even further marginalised because they don't have the transport in order to do what they need to do. And I think over the last few years, that's been getting worse. But the interesting thing is, just as Pete said, we're not rational as decision makers, as people. I think lots of the models, again, assume that we make rational decisions all the time. But we really don't. We're making our decisions about transport on all sorts of different levels, and different people make different decisions. The models don't capture that at all. So people make decisions sometimes about their concern about the environment, or their health, or their safety, and sometimes a mixture of all of those things. I've just written a paper where in psychology there's about 200 or so cognitive biases that have been identified over the years. We've taken about 40 of them and show how that impacts on judgment at the end of the day. So that shows there isn't a link between that rational decision making. There's something else going on within it all in 40 different examples as a result of just ordinary things that make us human every day. So we've got to not, as O'Connell says nicely over there, we mustn't treat transport as a system of rational actors, and we've got to look more at the social context and stop thinking that things are purely objective. There's a brilliant paper out recently from a friend of mine, Ian Walker, at Swansea University. So we know from Aberystwyth, if we can talk about Swansea sometimes, especially when it's Ian's paper. He's coined the term motor normativity, just showing as an example of some of that irrationality that in society we privilege or champion the car beyond other modes of transport. And he showed that nicely just by asking people simply and changing the way you ask the same question. So if you just look at the top example, people shouldn't smoke in highly populated areas where other people have to breathe in the cigarette fumes. And you can see that almost everyone strongly agrees with that. They certainly agree or strongly agree with it. And then when you put people shouldn't drive in highly populated areas where other people have to breathe in the car fumes, that falls hugely. Those blue and orange bars go down to 17% from something that was well over 70% the other way around. Same when it comes to drink alcohol less versus driving less, and belongings in the street that you leave there versus leaving the car in the street. All the time we're sort of putting the car in a slightly different privileged position, and that underpins lots of the decision making we make about transport at the end of the day. I called it institutional carism, which I really liked for a while, but it's turned into motor normativity. I've lost the battle against Ian there with the terminology. This is what I always show the students that I teach as well, because, and this comes out really nicely in the work that Pete's done in his book, that cars for years have been sold around things that are actually aspirational but largely unattainable. Independence, freedom, status, control, things that we all want in our lives. We really don't sell public transport on those levels. When did you last see an advert for a bus that was showing how sexy the bus looked or how amazing it was to have a chauffeur take you around the place? We're not very good at that. I mean, there have been some railway adverts a little bit moving towards that, and there have been certainly some airline adverts that move towards that. But we don't do that particularly for the bus. We don't do that very much for active travel either. Yet the car manufacturers have done that for years. That's why, it's no surprise Pete comes from an advertising background. You sell on aspiration, you sell on what people really want. If transport was about getting from A to B, we really wouldn't just be using cars at the end of the day. It's about having a status symbol, it's about having something you want to show off to the rest of the world. And that's typified. I always show the students or get them to come up with songs or films or books about modes of transport. And it's really easy. The people who I give the car as the mode of transport to always finish first. Plane finishes second, train, quite a few about that. But way down the list are things like bicycle and bus. In fact, we sing more about motorcycles and boats than we do about bicycles and buses at the end of the day. In fact, buses are the same as rockets and horses at the end of the day, as modes of transport. So they're not seen as very aspirational, not things that we reflect in our popular culture very easily. So if we want to change some of that, if we want to change the narrative and we want to equal up some of those other modes of transport, we've got to think differently about how we provide these alternatives and how we view transport as a whole. And norms is really important as another example of what happens. We did a really interesting project a few years back about people who'd broken their wrist, and they were all drivers. They had their wrist in a cast, and still 18% of them drove their car with their cast on. Much more likely to be males than females, always is in transport terms, more risky, that kind of thing. But interestingly, it did mean that 82% of people did change their travel behavior for those 5 to 6 weeks. So they went on buses, or they walked, or they did something different. They got lifts and things like that. And almost all of them really enjoyed doing that, but they only enjoyed it in terms of a temporary fix. So somebody talking about sitting at the front of the bus upstairs again and how enjoyable that was, hadn't done that since they were a kid. But all of them couldn't wait to get back in the car, and all of them did afterwards. And that's a really important thing about habit and about norms. We get used to what we should choose to do, and some things, particularly the car, because of motor normativity and things, is really dominant, and you fall back into the same routine again, even when you've disrupted it or changed it. So you've got to find a way of locking that in sometimes at the end of the day. I do lots of research about giving up driving, and you think the biggest problem is going to be access to things, access to shops and services in later life. That's part of the story. But I talk to lots of older people who are really upset about having to hand their keys in because they lose their independence, their freedom. There's older people who hardly do any miles per year, but the car's there almost like a comfort blanket so they could use it if they needed to. What if my partner goes into hospital? What if I need to support the kids? But they haven't done that for 5 or 10 years, so having to give that up is a real issue. But it's about their independence and their freedom at the end of the day. And of course, coronavirus was an excellent example of disrupting the norms. And we saw there's Castle Street in Cardiff here, and how we let cafes spill out onto the streets, and pedestrians and people became part of that street environment. And we saw huge increases in walking and cycling. Disappointingly, even within 6 months, that's how Castle Street changed back in the bottom right-hand corner, where cars were allowed once again to dominate that zone. There was chances and opportunities missed there to lock in some of that change that we made. Of course, our lives were hugely disrupted, and going back to normal probably meant we quickly went back to using modes of transport before. But even now, there's fewer people just about using trains. There's definitely fewer people using buses. But cars are almost exactly back up to what they were before. But interestingly, some research we've just done recently, the same way people talk about cars, they talk about using the bus if that's their default mode of transport. So we looked at the impact of the loss of bus services on the well-being of older people, and they had exactly the same things. They talked about how important the car was, about their bus use, but once they gave up that, or once they couldn't use that bus anymore, it was just as detrimental as the car. So I don't think it has to be the car. There's opportunities that it could be other modes of transport. The same things are operating in people's brains, if you like, if we sell them in that way, or if they're the things that people prioritize or champion at the end of the day. So how do we communicate in that space? There's a disconnect between professionals at the end of the day, and that's where the project I'm just going to show a couple of examples from in a minute before I finish came in. We still treat things, particularly things like road safety and transport planning, separately. They have separate budgets. They might come to the table sometimes in local authorities, but not always with the same hats on or the same ability to affect change. And they even have different language for the way things are looked at. People don't view those things differently. People don't think road safety is different to how they get out and about. That's all in their brain in the same place. And the same with their health and their well-being. For the 25 years that I've studied this, I know it doesn't look like I've looked at this for 25 years, but I have. 25 years ago, they talked about bringing more public health and health professionals to the table in local authorities to get them to talk to transport planners and to then begin to make decisions together on that. And there's been some wonderful examples where that's happened, but it's still not the default process, even when they're invited to consult and be part of it. And of course, logistics and delivery is part of all that as well. So the project that we wanted to develop was really a space and resource to bring the different people working together in transport, to allow those different groups of people to come together, to look at it from, I don't know which is the best phrase to use, planetary health or One Health terminology at the end of the day. So you're bringing that sustainability and the human and the animal health together, the planetary health with the human health, and making a difference. How do we do that? How do we bring that across and then let people have time and resource to work together on it? We talk about bringing the humans back into transport more, but the decision makers in transport planning are humans too, and they don't get enough space to bring that across. And it's about integrating different disciplines, if you like, or different backgrounds together at the end of the day. The social science, which I work with some brilliant scientists as well, but getting them all to work together in that space. Again, funding in academia has talked for years about bringing those things together and still doesn't do it very well. So we had a project that we called Think, had nothing to do with Think, the road safety project. Perhaps I should have thought of a different name for it. But it was the Transport and Health Integrated Research Network. And we largely left it up to our stakeholders to define what we did within it all. We wanted to bring together all those different organizations and groups. And over the last couple of years, we've got a network of 210 different stakeholders. A lot of them from research backgrounds, but a bit like me, they're researchers who don't want their research sat on dusty shelves. It's got charities involved, local government and policymakers, businesses and councils and national government as well involved in it all. And some of you in the room have been involved, which is lovely to see. And really, we left it up to our community, if you like, to define what it is they wanted. And we had a little tiny bit, not a lot, but a little bit of resource in order to bring some of those groups together to work around key problems and issues in the transport space as defined by them themselves. And whether that was offering space just to come together to discuss their needs, or it was about providing evidence-based reviews or training, that's, the figures on there are to hand back to my funder at the end of the day to say that we did stuff, but they're the overarching figures. But more exciting is what actually came out from it all. When we asked the community of people what they wanted from transport, we asked the public and we asked our stakeholders, then these are the kind of things that came out at the end of the day. The public talked very much about more public transport, about active travel, about more parity in the system, so transport justice. And our stakeholders talked about equitable, inclusive stuff. They talked about opportunities to collaborate, awareness of the impact on health, so more information and evidence on that. And more research, or more opportunities to get involved in research and collect data themselves and standardizing that and improving tools for decision making as a result. And so we came up with those 5 key themes: equality and transport justice, community and places, healthier, active and public transport choices. Rurality came out as a particular need and issue, as did vehicle speeds as a particular issue and the effects on that on the wider public. So we joined that together and made our efforts around those things. I won't go into detail on each of these, but there's the stuff that we did as a result of it. It's really heartening to see these things get taken on by the communities that we put in place. Instead of doing the research ourselves, we just enabled our partners to do the research at the end of the day. So things like the Gender Plus bus project in Wales has led to training bus drivers to be more aware of safety issues, particularly around females using buses and how to redesign the system around that, everything from bus stops to driver training. We've had research development groups about encouraging or what blocks people to do the things they want to do, including one in Pakistan about women and commuting to university and offering a mobility resource as a result of that, and so forth. Community and places was a really interesting hub to look at. So Gemma was involved in research development groups about social inclusion and community-led transport, or had really good idea about how community transport shouldn't just be seen as, you know, an old minibus for old people. There's so many more users that could use community transport, and how community transport moves beyond just that perception of being for people in need to things like offering car clubs and other opportunities like that, which really took that on, and we offered lots of different perspectives on that. Healthier, active and public transport choices over the last couple of years, developing ideas about how you put healthy, active travel more, embed it within different communities and different parts of the travel system, if you like, including right through to popular culture being on there. Again, the role of TV and films in presenting car culture and other different types of culture within it all. We had nice secondment opportunities, which was really good. So again, with charities, placing researchers within those, or bringing somebody from practice into the university. And rurality, like I said, was key. I don't know if that's because we did it from Aberystwyth, so it put it on people's minds, but it's definitely a big area, particularly with public transport use in the area. So that was a nice area to look at. And we supported some of the Welsh Government's development of 20 mile an hour as a default speed limit, and underpinned that with a little bit of resource with projects there. So just to sum up, just like Pete said, transport is about people at the end of the day. So we've got to bring people into the system in order to solve the transport issues and hear more from the people themselves. Data plays part of that, but it's also those stories that people bring in. So you've got to have a space, a resource, or permission for that to happen. You've got to bring people in order to do that. And so there's got to be more community-based work down at the community. If communities design their own transport systems, what would that look like? And that would be a really, that's really where we're at with the project at the moment. So they do that, as Natalie said at the start, that co-production type stuff and co-design. How do you design those interventions around your community that help with your transport at the end of the day? And allowing that to happen in different spaces also means that you bring professionals in to work with communities at different spaces. So it's allowing space for that to happen. Do you allow that through paying people to be part of that, or can you ask for their time for free? And there's different advantages and disadvantages to that. And then placing people within different systems, so secondments or mini projects, and offering training and mentorship around those things to just build that up. And we were able to do that, I think, really nicely over the last couple of years with that variety of partners. But unfortunately, like all these things, the funding for that has now run out. So what happens, as often happens with some really brilliant transport projects that I've seen, is they come to an end or they conclude and then they don't live on, or they live on in a bitty kind of way if you haven't got the bigger resource to bring it together. You really just hope that your community is strong enough to carry on with some of that. So in some places, perhaps that's what's happening. So the continuity of these things is really important and worth taking into account a little bit more. And that's where I finish, I think.